Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us basically on your lunchtime here today. We got on the last day here, and I'm sure your brains are like totally exploding at this point. So hopefully this will, even though it's a technical talk, we're trying to keep it at an approachable level. We are going to take time at the end for questions, so just keep that in mind. We'll talk about 40 minutes. I want to start kind of with a question for everyone here in the room. How many of you are actually server IT admins? A lot. And how many of you have tried to do load testing and capacity planning for Tableau Server? Okay, fair number of hands. So what we're going to run through today is how to approach this topic and how to use TabJolt to inform, do your testing and inform that planning process. I'm Zach Bowler. I've been at Tableau 1.5 years now, and I'm on the VizQL server team. We also have the scalability team within us as part of what we do, and I'll let Ravi introduce himself.
Yeah, my name is Ravi. I'm also on the VizQL server and scalability teams. My team owns TabJolt and testing of the VizQL server. And I'm at Tableau for about 4 years, and this is my third TC.
Yeah, I forgot that. This is my first TC, so it's been quite amazing to see everyone and interact, and I've tried to go to some talks as well. So, all right. So I'll briefly go through the agenda just to make sure you're in the right place, and you can go. If you run screaming out of here, that's fine too. Don't worry about it. First, we're just going to talk about scalability testing in general and some things to keep in mind about it. Then, how does this apply to Tableau Server specifically? So there's some important things to think about and some differences when you're thinking about Tableau Server versus a traditional application. Then we'll talk about TabJolt, which is kind of the mechanism that we use, and this is the tool we use internally to do our scalability testing. And then there's some demos interspersed. So Ravi will actually run through installing TabJolt, setting it up, and kind of giving you an introduction on how to do it. And then we'll point you to some documentation that can give you additional detail on that. And then finally, how do you use those results? So you'll obtain some results, and how should you be thinking about capacity planning in general? How do you approach this endeavor? So I'll try to walk around. The room's big, and it's kind of narrow here, so I'll try to walk back and forth a little bit so we don't miss anyone. So there's probably not a better analogy for our journey here than climbing a mountain. You can go on a little hike, and it's no big deal. You don't need to think or pre-plan too much. If you're scaling a mountain, you need to actually put some forethought into what you're going to do. Otherwise, things are not going to go well for you. And as I said, there's kind of a generic way people think about scalability testing often. We have a specific definition we're going to use for this talk, and so here's the one we're using for Tableau Server specifically. So as you increase your users or the complexity of your workload, so that could be number of workbooks, how complex your dashboards are, you want to maintain consistent performance. Now, the way scalability is typically approached is folks will set up an SLA. They'll think of like, here's a set amount of time I want things to happen with. And even in the reporting space, that's pretty typical, right? So you have kind of static reports. This is kind of older school analytics solutions. Tableau Server is a little different, and so we'll go here. So if you're thinking about Tableau Server, you want to think about it a little differently. So one of the big differences with Tableau Server when you're thinking about scalability, the load is very heterogeneous. So with many applications, you'll have kind of a single type of request, and you can set an SLA on it that's 5 seconds, right, or 3 seconds, and every request will take that long. It's going to vary considerably with Tableau Server depending on these factors that we'll go through. So number one, this is a shared one with any kind of scalability. The environment. So your topology, are you using physical machines? Or are you using virtualized machines? That will have effect. How are they provisioned? So do you have 16 cores per worker? Do you have 832? How much memory? Those are important things to consider. Here's one that's more specific to Tableau Server. Are you using live data or extracts? What are the frequency of those extracts? What is the size? How many columns and rows of data do you have? That's going to substantially affect what you're going to see. And the third one, workload, so the workbook complexity. So you have the data aspect, but then the workbook itself can really dramatically change what you're going to see as well. And the thing that I'll kind of emphasize and re-emphasize as we do this talk is scaling is not a solution to a slow workbook. So I think actually this talk just happened before here. I think it was 10:45. They had a designing efficient workbooks. Was anyone able to attend that one? Great. We'll reference back. We're not going to go into depth on that, but this scaling solution is not a solution for a slow workbook. If you start with a slow workbook and you scale out, it's going to continue to be slow and you'll have problems. So you really want a baseline there. And then also, how many users you have. So I talked about workbooks, but I mean, that's kind of the crux of this, right? What's the concurrency level that you're shooting for? And then finally, Tableau, again, this heterogeneity, well, I'll say the word right, issue where there are different usage profiles. A person coming in the morning that just views a viz real quickly, loads it up and takes a quick look, that's very different than an analyst who's going to be creating new content, publishing stuff. Those have very different resource costs, and so you need to think about those distinctly. So those are abstract factors. How do you actually approach those and create a test plan? TabJolt is our answer here. Off-the-shelf tools are great tools to do scalability testing generally. We encountered some challenges internally at Tableau on how to use those, because often what you have to do is you have to script them, so you might have a visual scripting kind of process where you click through, you create your scripts, you execute those. They change. If your UI, if your dashboards change, you'd have to go back and redo all that. And what TabJolt does, how it's different is it actually understands what is within a workbook. So it can introspect that workbook, look at what interactions are possible in the workbook, and then execute those. You don't need to do that scripting aspect. You just need to say, here's the workbooks I want to use. Here's how much usage I want to simulate. Covered that. It's based on Apache JMeter. So if you're familiar with Apache JMeter, a lot of this terminology will probably be familiar, and also if you want to get more advanced, you can probably look at that documentation and it might kind of generate some ideas on how to think about this testing. And we make it available on GitHub, so you just go download it. It's out there. The source code is not public. Maybe we can think about that at some point, but that is not the case right now. And there's community support, and we also, as the team that owns TabJolt, we try to be responsive to questions. We can't catch them all, but when we see things that are going unanswered for a while, we try to step in and help. So here you have on the right a kind of prototypical deployment of Tableau Server. Don't get too caught up in the details. It's just to give you a representation. It's got 4 nodes here: VizQL, the app server, Hyper, gateway in front. And then we have TabJolt. So TabJolt's running on a separate machine called an injector. That's JMeter, and it's taking those workbooks that you configure for it, sending those requests to the gateway like a user. So it's really trying to simulate what users are doing. And then it has a separate Postgres database. So there's a Postgres database that's installed as part of Tableau Server. TabJolt has its own. That's intentional. We kind of don't want the access to that data and writing data to that database to interfere with the actual testing activity that TabJolt's doing. And with TabJolt, you get a workbook out of the box. So you go install TabJolt. You have a summary workbook, a TWIB, that will use that test results database as a data source and has quite a few vizes that let you kind of dissect that data. And you can also access that Postgres database directly yourself and do whatever you want. The TWIB is intended to kind of make it easy. This process, as I said, you just go, there's a URL, Ravi will run through this, download, install it. It's a click-through. It's like super easy to install. And then the thing that I would want to emphasize is, as you start TabJolt, you can kind of play around with it, but if you're actually thinking about doing actual testing, validate that the topology that you're going to run your tests against is actually the one that you're using in your production environment. So if you used the out-of-the-box installer, that may or may not be, just to set up a TabJolt run, that may not be actually what you have in your production environment. You really want to simulate as closely as possible what you're going to be doing. And then the other thing that doesn't happen automatically as part of this install is enabling JMX ports. So those will let you collect richer information about your run and kind of what's going on in the machines. Finally, run with a single workbook. So validate that your install worked, that you don't have any kind of fundamental problems with how you've configured things. People might screw up the address of the Tableau Server instance, right? If you, it's basic knowledge, right? But start small, figure it out. And then here's the TwibX. So, or not TwibX, it's a Twib. Ravi will go into this in more depth, and he'll actually kind of dive in and show you how to look at these results and interpret them. You see kind of a scatter plot of response times. It should have CPU, it's hard for me to read even, CPU, memory, and you'll see at the bottom here there's a whole bunch of sheets that give you all sorts of information on the metrics that you collected when you did your run. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ravi, and he'll actually run through this install process and setting things up. Take it away.
All right. Let me switch to my computer. As Zach mentioned, it's very straightforward to download and install TabJolt. So you can just search for TabJolt on GitHub, and you can go to releases page. We just published latest version like few days back, and here is the downloader. You can click on it and download. And instead of making you guys watch going through the whole installation, I just saved some screenshots. Otherwise, we will all be waiting like, hey, let the installer finish. So it just asks you where you want to install, and you can specify whatever the directory you want. And then once it is done installing, it has some dependencies. TabJolt has dependency on Java and PostgreSQL. So we copy JRE bits for you. You don't have to pre-install Java and set your paths or anything. The Java is included as part of the package. We just reference it directly. And similarly, PGSQL bits are also included in the package. We install it for you. There are schema files that are included, which I'm going to show you in a bit. And once it is done installing, it's going to ask you about where your Tableau Server is installed. You just point it to the URL, and you give it Tableau Server admin username and password. And at that point, it's going to log into your Tableau Server. And by default, it's going to populate whatever the most popular workbooks are, workbooks and views. So by default, it's going to populate top 5, but you can always go change it to whatever you like. And finally, these are all configuration steps. At the end of installation, it will walk you through this. At the end, it's going to ask you if the the user that is running the TabJolt, if that user has permissions to collect performance counters remotely. As long as you have admin permissions remotely, you should be able to collect those counters. If you don't, you can specify that use a different username and password. You can specify those things. Okay. Now, I'm going to show you installed version that I just installed this morning on one of the boxes. Okay. So once you install, this is how your installer directory looks like. Let me walk you through some of the important files here. For example, if you don't want to install PGSQL as part of this, if you want to install a previously installed PostgreSQL, you can tell TabJolt installer that don't install PGSQL, and it will skip that part and it will go through. And since we need some tables created, etc., for us to store the results, we supplied these schema files here. So you can use these schema files and go create these tables where we're going to store the results. Okay? Then we have installation guide part of it. And let me walk you through some of these folders. In config folder, there are some important files that I want to walk you through. So this is the file that got populated automatically based on what the popular workbooks are. You can just go here and edit. You can add, delete to your HOTS content. And next file is userpool.csv. So by default, it's going to use whatever we used to log in during configuration step. But if you have a test environment where you have maybe hundreds of users, you can go to this file and keep adding some test users here, username, password, and role is a literal string. It says viewer, interactor, or server administrator. Yeah. Oh, you can. It's called userpool.csv. Yes. Yes. Inside, this is the TabJolt installation folder. Okay. Inside this folder, there's a configuration folder. Inside config folder, I have a couple of files that I'm walking through. Okay. The first one was workbooks file. The second one is users file. Okay. Now, and there's one more file that you can take a look, which is called perf-test-config.yaml. This one has information about where your Postgres is installed, what's the username, password, and the port number for your database. So if you skipped installing Postgres, and if you want to point your installation to some other location, this is the file you would need to edit. You would give your DB server name as xyz.lan or whatever, and then you give this information. And there are a few more things that I want you to take a look here. Number one, think time between tests. If you, in general, if you don't do anything, by default, these are set to 0. What it means is that when you run your load test, this is we create X number of threads, whatever you specify. And these threads are going at whatever rate that they are going. It's going to load the view, go next. Load the view, go the next. Just keeps on going. Or if there is interactions that you specified, it's going to do those interactions and just keep going. But in practice, users will not be doing that, right? So if you want to model your load or usage, you want to think about what think times that you want to specify. So that's we documented all of these in our PDF that we supplied along with the installation. You can take a look at to get better understanding of what these are. And yeah, these are probably the most important ones. And finally, test plans. So test plan is what you specify when you run your test. So there is one test that's called view with load test. If you have some dashboards that you expect your users to only look at them, not interact with them much, if you want to model that load, this is the test plan that you are going to use. And if you have some dashboards that you think there's a mix of users that are going to view and interact, there's a test plan for that. And if you expect majority of your users are going to interact with the dashboards, and this is the test plan. Interact one is the one that you're going to use. Oops, that's too big. Let's go up. Oh my God. Oops, sorry, 1 second. I'm trying to get out of this Windows Zoom thing. I'm not sure how to. Magnifying glass. Click on this guy maybe. Just close, I think. Oh, thank God. Thanks.
I noticed you have password plain text. So wait, not have that in plain text?
So that's why, since this is a test tool, We don't expect your database to hold any sensitive information. This is mostly about how long it took to load certain dashboard. You just go against it and load that. So make sure that your DB doesn't have any important information. But
let's,
There's no plain text,
Yeah.
that's a security issue.
yeah.
And we're going to be probably running this on a server, a utility server,
Okay.
not on someone's desktop. And so,
let's chat
Let's-
more. Let's hold the questions until the end, and we can talk with you about that. Yeah, no problem.
All right, now, so once we have installation done and configured, we are ready to run the test. And the way to run your test is there is a batch file that is included, which is called go, and you specify the test plan, and followed by duration, and duration is in seconds, followed by number of threads that you want to run against. I specified like 5 threads, and some description, and I click go. It's gonna run against the server that I already set up. As you can see, one thing that you might want to pay attention at the beginning is make sure that there are no errors going on. And I'll let it finish. I'll come back and walk you through the results. And I already did a run before which has errors. I'll also walk you through that. And I'll show you a few things on what to pay attention, etc. Okay.
Cool. So as you saw there, I think it's relatively straightforward to set it up. Click through a few files that you're editing. Even I was capable of doing it, so that says something. Now, once you have TabJolt set up, how should you be thinking about this testing? One of the things that you want to make sure you do is engage the stakeholders. It does happen, and we'll get pulled in sometimes to professional services engagements, things like this, where there's an escalation. We try to avoid that, but sometimes it does happen. And sometimes why that's happened is because there's a disjoint between what the folks that have set up a Tableau Server installation have set expectations for and what the business expects. So if you have a CEO that thinks every dashboard should load in 4 seconds and no more, and you've got these, you don't really have a lot of constraints on what people can do, and people publish stuff, and then you have a really slow one, there's going to be a mismatch between those expectations. So make sure those folks are part of this discussion, and also how many users you're expecting. Are there new divisions that are going to come on? Think about where are you going in the future, and a lot of those different folks will have input into that process. You may not be aware of certain things. The other thing with doing this planning, and I'm going to look at my notes here because I've forgotten 1 or 2 of my points here. Again, as I said, the key thing before you test is that your workbooks are performing as you expect them. If they don't perform, I said this at the beginning, if they're not performing as you expect on desktop, they are not going to perform as you expect once you start scaling out. They're going to be slow. So go back. The talk earlier today was designing efficient workbooks. I think it takes some time before those come out. They gave that talk last year as well, and I know that's up on YouTube, so you can go hunt designing efficient workbooks and look at the white paper. That's a key step in this process. If you have garbage input, you'll have garbage output of this test. And then last, I said this as well earlier, so some of these points you'll hear me reiterating. They're important. Make sure that the environment that you're testing, that you're doing your testing in, reflects your production environment. This is another thing that we see time and again, which is folks will have a sandbox or test environment. They'll start doing their testing. They're super unhappy with the performance. And then we ask, well, what is that environment and what is your production environment? Oh, our production environment is 32 cores. Our test environment is 8 cores. Those are going to give different results. It doesn't need to be the same size, but for example, like how you've provisioned the workers should be the same. So maybe you have 5 workers in your production environment and you only have 1 in your test, but they should be provisioned similarly in terms of the worker, as close as possible. And any other kind of configurational stuff that you have should be as close as possible to that. The other thing to think about is if you haven't actually gone live with your deployment, you have an awesome opportunity to use that environment to do your testing in. So once you have live users in that environment, you're not going to be able to use it. If you are, kind of planning a big deployment, we see this increasingly. Tableau has kind of moved from this land and expand model where people kind of started small and then grew out their deployments. More frequently now we see large deployments from the very beginning. If you've got that environment and no one's in it yet, try to get your testing in there, right? Also make sure that people aren't in there doing work. So this is another thing, and this is on the next slide as well. So this test plan, what are like kind of the concrete steps of creating this test plan? This isn't at the level of editing those files that Ravi showed, but it's kind of conceptual. Choose workbooks. So you want representative workbooks. A great way to figure this out, there's admin views. Are people familiar with admin views in Tableau Server, I hope? You can go and look at your most popular views. Now, TabJolt did pick, you saw it kind of pick the top 5 most popular workbooks. That may or may not be the list that you want. And you want a mix of, for example, if you have live data sources on some of your workbooks and you have extracts on other ones, have a mix of those, both of those things. Don't just do one or the other. If there's different type of interactions, if some are kind of more view heavy and some are more interact, have that mix as well represented. The usage, again, this is back to these different profiles. So are people primarily viewing these workbooks, or are they, do you have a huge amount of publishing? I mean, that's going to be drastically affect your results. You want to model, and in fact, in the newest release of TabJolt, you can model kind of the creator license. This was not possible in older versions. Ravi can maybe mention briefly on that. You want kind of that mix of what you're going to see. Peak usage, or concurrency, what is the max number of users you're expecting? You're not going to have, if you have 600 licenses, you're not going to have all those people using it at the same time. Again, admin views can be your friend here and help give you an idea of what you're shooting for. You might also just have a business, a notion from the business of how many users you're expecting. And then you want to run this for a decent duration. 10 minutes is still pretty short. If you run it really short, just a couple minutes, you're not going to see, the performance isn't going to be what you expect, because things like caching. So a bunch of people will view the same workbook. And if you don't do it for long enough, because these are kind of random interactions and random workbooks, the results won't be cached, and that won't be reflected in your results. It'll skew things. It'll make them look worse than they are. As Ravi mentioned, think time. This is critical. If you put no think time at all in, this figure came from the professional services folks that deal with kind of on-prem deployments and just empirically observed. So I don't know how much science is behind it. It's just kind of a rule of thumb that they said. I think they said 4 to 5 users per thread. The reason why that is when you're running TabJolt, it's just running stuff as fast as it can. It's going to be slamming that server as quickly as it can. It's going to load up the workbook, send a request, not wait at all, right? A user is going to load that workbook, look at it. It might be 10 seconds. It might be 5 seconds. It might be 20 seconds. It can be a little bit challenging to estimate what that time is. You can look at things like the logs to kind of inform that. You may have a notion that the workbooks you have a particular level of complexity, and so, hey, no one's going to look at this huge dashboard, although that's probably might be slow anyways, but we'll ignore that. They're not going to look at it for like 2 seconds and do something. They're going to be looking at it for like 20 seconds. Model that in what you're trying to test here. And then finally, stop other work. So don't have other people in the environment loading vises, doing stuff, using it, because it's going to totally screw up your results. And it'll look, because even a single request to Tableau Server can be quite expensive. If it's a really inefficient workbook, you've carefully curated your list of workbooks, you've made sure they're all performant, and someone comes in with some honking thing that takes like 40 seconds to load. Your results are going to look terrible. Don't do that. Also, antivirus, you don't want that kind of stuff running. You don't want updates going off. As much as possible, you want to isolate it so that from run to run, you can see consistent results. It's repeatable, and you can compare them. So hopefully, Ravi's run has finished, and if not, then I'll figure out something to say.
Right on time. So at the end of the run, this is how it's going to look like. It will say that I'm tidying up, and at the end it says that please use this run ID to look at your results. And it's going to keep incrementing this test run ID every time you do a test run. The reason it's so low is I had to get fresh install last night because someone else took my machine that I prepared for this demo.
But he's not naming any names.
But it didn't take too long. I just had to get a machine, and within 10 minutes, I was up and running. You just have to download the installer, point it to server. I did a couple of runs this morning just to have some more data that I can show it to you. That's it. Now that we know the test run ID that we have to look at, let me go back and show you how the run results look like. So there is a TWIB that we ship along with TabJolt, and we can use TabJolt to look at, Tableau desktop to look at the results. And the password is test results. This is also specified in one of the config files. You can look it up too. So this is the landing dashboard, and there are other dashboards too. I'm going to run through some of these. So here, number 3 is the run that we just did. Let me select that one first. This is only 5-minute run. So x-axis is the time, and we have error rate, and we have how many tests per minute that we are finishing, and what is the average response time for these dashboards. And at the top of the dashboard, we have a few other things such as what was the run ID, and what was the user account that we are running under, and the string that I specified, start time and end time, and how many threads that we used to kick off the run, what was the duration, during this duration, how many samples, how many test samples that we collected, and we have some other metrics like error rate that I just showed you in the graph below, and what is the average throughput, 90th percentile, 95th percentile, etc. Okay. Now, this is the landing dashboard, which gives you a quick overview of how your run went. For example, I intentionally did a run this morning, which would generate errors. Let me show it to you that, and also maybe add another run. For example, let's say you did 2 runs. You are trying to, say, validate a config change. Say you are going from 2 SQL servers to 4 SQL servers per worker. You want to see how that behaves, what effect it has on your load. You can do those 2 runs side by side, then come here, select both the runs, and see how your throughput behaved, what other things basically it cost. Okay? Now here, I didn't make any config changes. I just wanted to get some errors to show you how it looks like. Here you can see that error rate is like close to 40%. What I did is I went to vispool.csv file where we had our workbook names. I just edited some random names there. That's how I generated these errors in this case. But there might be other case where you will get into some errors. Let me show you some of those. So there is a dashboard called test failures. You can go here and take a look at what these errors are. So in this case, let me just select the interesting one. So here, it's going to show you all the workbooks that generated errors and how many errors each workbook generated. That gives a quick overview of the offending workbooks, and you can take a look and see what's going on there. In my case, since I gave some random names, of course it gives a 404. 404, it's not found, right? And then there is another dashboard which gives you scatter plot of 1 or 3. Let me select the 3 that we just ran. Scatter plot of the responses that we got. Here, let's say, for example, if you want to look at all the, so each test, right, it does bunch of things. It does call init session, and then it's going to call bootstrap. Before even that, it's going to log into your server. We record everything that goes on. Let's say you want to see what's going on with the login. You can select it and just say keep only. Okay? And you can see that vast majority of the logins took under 200 milliseconds in this case. And there are other steps that if you want to drill down and take a look at what happened, you can do that too. And next important thing is, while we are running our tests, what's going on in the server, right? Like what's going on with the CPU, what's going on in the memory, metrics, etc. So there is a dashboard called CPU and memory. You can go here and just select your run and see what happened. So localhost is the machine where TabJolt is installed and run. So this is your injector box. And I ran test against this machine called TSPerf335. And those are the metrics of your Tableau server. If your Tableau installation has one primary and couple of workers, they're all going to show up in this dashboard. Since I had a pretty straightforward just one box topology, that's all it's going to show up. And the first one is, these are all at system level. Yeah. Mm-hmm. You don't have to specify. If you want to collect metrics from every box, then you can specify first primary, then followed by workers. I can show you in the documentation where it is specified at the end. Okay. And these metrics are at the system level. This is CPU usage at the system level. In our case, it hovered around 15+%, and this is memory usage at the system level again. Now, if you want to drill down and look at other processes, there are dashboards that are pre-built for other processes. In our case, let's look at WSQL Server. This is what WSQL Server looks like. If you see WSQL Server process, here it says 100%. How is that possible when the system itself is at 15%, right? So these are the counters that are coming from Windows. Windows basically aggregates across all the cores and reports it. So in my case, I believe I have 16 physical cores and 32 virtual cores. So we have to divide this number by 32 to get the actual CPU usage. That's why it looks high. Now, this is the memory usage on various instances of WSQL Server. I believe I had 4 WSQL servers on this box. I know it looks steep, but if you look at the actual value itself, drill down, it's only, I believe, 3 gigs or 4 gigs. Generally, WSQL Server, it keeps filling up the caches. It doesn't release them until it has to. So that's why it just keeps hoarding in the hopes that somebody would need it, and so that it can serve the request out faster. I think that's all I have to show from the demo perspective. If you have any more questions, I'm more than happy to answer at the end.
Yeah, we'll have 20 minutes.
Yeah,
we'll have 10 or 15,
yeah,
20 minutes.
We'll have plenty of time, I think.
Can you switch it back?
Yeah.
Ravi ran through the analysis of those results. Hopefully those were relatively clear, but if you have questions, again, we'll have some time here at the end. A few points I do want to emphasize with that. Number one, I've said this thing about 5 times. Don't throw anything at me. I really do want to drive this point home. The response time of a particular workbook is going to depend on the efficiency of the workbook. Don't focus on that alone. What you do want to focus on is what happens to that response time as you're adding more and more users. If it's loading in 10 seconds at the beginning, and then as you are hammering the system with more and more people, it slows down to 20 or 30 seconds, that's really bad. You don't want that. But if it was 20 seconds at the beginning, don't expect it to get better as you're going. There's also going to be some variability in that response time. Tableau Server deals with traffic and it has kind of a spiky profile, and it will try to use the resources it has to service the request it has. And so, as I said, the load pattern on Tableau Server is pretty atypical for a web application. You will have a really heavyweight request to render a viz, and it's going to be chugging and taking as much as it can. If something else is going on at that very same time, it can be impacted. And so you may see some variability. Now, you don't want to see that pervasively and with huge swings. That's indicative of a problem that you don't have enough resources to service your requests. But there's going to be some resources. You'll see, as he showed on the scatter plot, there were probably a couple of points that were little outliers. It's not going to every time be exactly the same. And there probably will be some errors. As you're loading the system to its capacity, we're trying to push it to kind of its breaking point. Things may time out. As I said, if there's a ton of other stuff going on, a request may time out, and it'll show up as an error. You can look for things like if there's bad credentials. I mean, you might have, if you're having a huge amount of errors, that's something where you want to go look. That's going to impact your results, and it's going to screw them up. But there's probably, as you're approaching your limits for what the system can handle, it's going to start to have a few in there. So you have your test, you've done it, you've performed it, you have a set of results. They're not what you want them to be, right? They look bad. What do you do next? The first thing is to use those screens that Robbie ran through, and you can look at a process level. And so look at Viz Portal, VizQL Server, and what's the last one?
Data server.
Data server, yes, thank you. And data server, and look at those process metrics. So is one of those getting pegged in terms of CPU or memory? That's a place to start drilling in to see if you have under-resourced that in some manner. If that all looks good, you probably want to start hunting. You may have kind of a rogue piece of content. Ideally, you vetted what you put into this process, but if you didn't, go back and look at that and see if there's a particular workbook where you're really seeing high variance. You can go look at the admin views. The admin views will still work, right? You're just throwing load at this server. You can go see, and it has a couple screens that will show kind of average load time. You might also, you can look at the logs as well. That's a little more esoteric. Look for something where you're seeing really wide variance or really slow load times, and look at that workbook. Is that workbook causing problems to your tests in general? You can kind of take a deductive process where you pull stuff out, right? If it's really like totally a mess, start small, go back to the beginning, start with a single workbook. Hey, see if that's producing the results you want. Add another one, add another. At the point at which you see problems, then you've kind of identified a problem workbook. And we do that internally with our testing. So when we test Tableau Server for releases, right, we have quite a few workbooks in a suite. And when there's a new release, sometimes something will happen, right? So maybe some functionality slightly changed, and it does happen. We try to catch that earlier in the process, but sometimes we'll get to our testing, and it totally screws up the results, and we have to go find that particular workbook, like something changed, right? An authentication mechanism, something that we were doing. Let me see if there's any, pop over here, Robbie. And then, if you've gone through that process and you haven't seen anything that's really a clear indicator of a problem, it's still like, I don't know what's going on. Logs are kind of that last step. You can take the logs, and we have a number of tools. LogShark, or maybe by show of hands, are people familiar with LogShark? A good number of folks. LogShark, Tableau Log Viewer. You can take the logs that were emitted during your run and kind of look at them and look for this also might be kind of part of that process of having identified a bad workbook. So you have a bad workbook, like what is bad about it, right? Why is it causing problems? There was a whole talk, I think yesterday, it was quite good. I think it was from IBM Watson. So they kind of showed this process of going through perf recorder. So perf recorder is something we also own. And they ran the workbook, kind of looked at what the perf recorder results were on desktop for that single workbook, kind of isolated it. Is it a really slow query that's running against a bajillion columns or something like that? That's kind of this iterative process you can take. And similarly with the logs, you can kind of go look, and there's a number of log things that will be emitted, like here's the query that's running, and here's how long it took to run. Find those, pull those out. As part of that process, hopefully you've identified, it could be a workbook, it could be you didn't have enough RAM or cores for your server, right? That should pop at those process levels. That's an easier thing to figure out. You've kind of got what you wanted to get, and you achieved your end. So one thing, one of the kind of key statements that we make, we produce a white paper as well with the results that we do internally when we test. So there's a link at the end here for the latest version. We're going to have a new one out pretty soon as well. One of the key statements is that Tableau Server scales linearly. So this was kind of back to that point where I said, even if you have fewer instances of VizQL workers, have them be similar. Because the idea is if you've established a baseline on a single server, that should be linear. So if you have 100 users, 100 concurrent users you can support on a 16-core box with 64 gig of memory, whatever you have. Then you add 2, and it should be pretty close to it supports 200. It may not be exact, but it's going to be pretty close. So you have these results, and you have a notion of what you're doing at this point of time. But it is a point in time. It's going to change. Don't go into this activity thinking you can do this as a one-time thing, not revisit it. We tend to think of this in kind of 6-month intervals. Work generally say think a year and a half, and think in kind of 6-month intervals. Think about, are you planning to upgrade to a new version of Tableau Server? Are you adding new data sources that are really big? Whatever you're testing, where you've established kind of a concurrency rate and that linear scaling formula, if you add an enormous database with a huge amount of data or drastically different use cases, those results they're not going to be valid anymore. Now you can test simple things, right? Like Ravi said, you can do configuration changes, the load's identical, you run it once, you tweak a little bit, or you give 8 cores or 16 or 32, whatever. Those more complex ones, you want to go back and look at again. What is your workbook selection? What is your mix of tests? What are the peak users that you're trying to achieve? What's your response time? Think about that again, and do that regularly. Let's see if there's anything. And then the other thing to think about is typically when we're giving guidance on when should you start thinking about adding more capacity, typically we say about 80%. So if you've hit 80% CPU or memory utilization on your deployment on your boxes, on one or more of your boxes, you're seeing that kind of regularly, you need more capacity. It will spikily hit 100, but if it's kind of consistently at that 80% mark, you need more capacity. And you can see that again, I believe, so TabMon, some tools like that can give you insight into that.
Yeah, there is a tool named TabMon, which you can pretty, I believe it's fairly simple too. It can keep an eye on what's going on at the resource utilization on your server. And you can look at maybe even set some alerts. There's a new feature, alerts. If you are using it, you should be able to get some email that says that, hey, these machines are regularly hitting these targets or are exceeding the targets. Time to look at it.
So I'm going to make sure we have time. So I'm going to try to race through. There's only 1 or 2 more slides. So you have time, and we can chat offline as well. So we're not heading to anything after this. We just put, as Ravi showed, we just put out a new version of TabJolt. Just want to highlight a few things. And I think it actually says 2018.2 in the title. In the notes, it says it supports up through 2018.3. 2018.3, it just came out. Go download it, give it a shot, see if you have any issues. There were some incompatibilities with the preceding version with TSM. And so we finally gotten those fixed. There were questions. There were some workarounds for these things, but the old version was around tab admin. Now you can do TabJolt with Linux installs. We had this internally because we had to do the testing ourselves, but it wasn't publicly available. So finally, with this version, you can run TabJolt against a Linux install. It supports the web authoring cases. So not just the view and interact that Robbie was talking about, but also file upload. Basically, the content creation can be modeled in TabJolt now. And finally, we integrated replayer. So I don't know if did anyone go to the replayer talk? Yes? Cool. So we've integrated replayer as well, and that gives a different way of using TabJolt to do your testing. So replayer essentially takes log statements and reruns the traffic. The difference with TabJolt is it's kind of taking a set of workbooks, randomly selecting interactions. It's not going to be identical every single time. So that's one point to emphasize, right? If you want a rigidly, and I would say you don't mostly want a rigidly replayed set of traffic, but in some cases that's really what you do need. Replayer will give you that facility, and now it's integrated with TabJolt. Key takeaways. We're at the top of the mountain. Hopefully we didn't lose anyone to hypothermia, or I'll see if there's any sleepy eyes. We're at the top of the mountain. Use TabJolt. It will make your life a lot easier than All the time we have people, there's lots of great tools, like it's hard to support them and it's going to take a lot of time to get those up and running. If you have a great expertise, then go for it. TabJolt's going to make your life simpler though if you're approaching this fresh. Test with the load that represents what you're going to be seeing in your production environment. The workload, the workbook types, the data source types, the volume of data. Use those results to inform your capacity planning exercise. And then be doing this on a regular basis. Again, 6 months, I mean, more often is great, but typically people are not doing it that frequently. So with that, I'll skip ahead and we'll come back. Here's a couple links. You can probably just even search on these things and find some of this content. I see people taking photos. So. Those are long URLs. Good luck with that. Oh, someone else want a picture? You want a picture? I can go back. Yeah, these will be posted. I don't know how long it takes after the talks. Yeah, a week. And then these were some other talks. I think, unfortunately, most of these all have occurred already. But you can go and look. They should have recordings of these as well. So after the fact, you can go look. And there are some of these, for example, the Designing Efficient Workbooks, which I don't have on here. Even though they just gave that, there was one last year. So you can go look that up as well. And that's a great talk. I watched it myself. And then also, I would be remiss, fill out the survey, give us feedback, good, bad, not indifferent. That won't help us. And then questions. So we'll go ahead.
Yeah.
And you may want to repeat the question as well, so
Yeah.
because it's going to be recorded.
Uh-huh. Right. Yeah, let me repeat the question. Is there a way to ramp up the usage? So there are some advanced test plans inside the test plans folder. One of the test plans is a step-up test plan. Basically, it can keep stepping up the number of users. Since it uses Apache JMeter underneath, JMeter has a mechanism where it can keep stepping up the load, and you can specify, what is the interval, like wait 5 minutes and then step up by 5 or 10 extra threads. Keep going until, say, 20 minutes or 30 minutes, and then be done with it. There is a way to customize and use one of the test plans that is in there. Yeah. I'll go back. Yeah.
So Asha, 2 questions.
Okay.
So the replay, what uses the long-shot history of the active track? Does that count for the time?
Good question. I'm not
As far
sure
as I'm aware,
actually.
it does not, but we'd have to go verify that with Umapathy, I think. To my knowledge, it doesn't add additional. So because replayer is basically replaying that traffic, it's going to use the timings that were actually in the log. Yeah.
So if there's a delay between sessions, what happens?
I don't believe it uses it, but shoot us an email, we can confirm it for sure.
Yeah, I can confirm.
The /interact
Yeah.
direct drop that you have, what's the breakdown on that? Is that 80/20?
I believe it's 50/50. 50/50. Yeah, so let me repeat the question. So there are a bunch of test plans I showed you. One was view only, one was interact only, one was view and interact. What is the split between view and interact test plan? It's 50/50.
And I guess the last one, sorry guys.
It's okay.
For the error rate,
Mhm.
for such a push server, so we get errors. Is there a way to set thresholds on what goes on? Because if you allocate or relate that to time or SLA that you have defined, right? Is there a way to define that?
There is a setting in perf-test config YAML where you can specify if you hit X number of errors, there is no point in doing the test anymore, stop it. There are 1 or 2 settings there. I forgot the exact setting name, but you can specify, yeah, there are 2 settings actually. One is consecutively if you hit X number of errors, there is no point. Or there is one more setting that says in aggregate, if I hit Y number of errors, stop. Either one of these conditions meets, there's no point at this point running this test anymore. You can stop it. Sorry, 1 second. Let me finish. Yeah, hello. You can specify what dashboards you want to run against. Right? There is a config file that I showed you at the beginning. You can specify what all the dashboards you are interested in. Just specify that. The only catch is that right now, at least there is no way to specify, I want this dashboard 20% of the time, next dashboard say 10% of the time. Someone asked about it. That's something that shouldn't be that hard to code it up and release version. Yeah, I'll come once.
How do you set up those key metrics so that once there's a lot of data that you can get out of this that you just showed, but then what are the exact like 5 key things that we look upon so that anyone who's new to using TabJolt, so that we can set up those criteria and then have a successful test?
Sure. So I always start looking at the error rate. That's the first thing I usually look at. Error rates, meaning that if my server can even keep up, right? That's one thing I look at. And then once I look at it, next thing I usually look at is how the server utilization was. Look at CPU usage, memory usage. If you have multiple workers, let's say primary and workers, look across the topology, see if there are any differences.
You may want to clip that. I don't think it's picking up anything on the mic there. You may want to clip it to your shirt there, Ryan.
Sorry.
Is there a specific number that you like is the benchmark that for reasonable SLA this is the industry-wide standard, or is it just contextual?
SLA for dashboards, I can't speak to that.
What was your, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
When mentioned about like error rates and CPU usage and memory usages, when you evaluate those numbers, which are fantastic, but then my question was like, how do you evaluate like what is good, what is bad, what is reasonable? So is there an accepted standard that we can leverage?
For CPU and memory, are you asking? Is there a standard for CPU?
Yeah,
Oh, and error rate? I mean, well, the general rule we have is 1% or under. Ideally, it's lower. This is in our internal testing.
Yeah,
Not with your actual deployment, right? So again, it's not going to be identical to what you see in production. It's kind of at capacity. What's your highest threshold? We say basically 1% or under is what we're shooting for. And then the kind of range in terms of CPU and memory utilization that we're shooting for is 75 to 85%. 80% is kind of, we just draw it down the middle, but that's kind of, a system is at about what it can load. You're using it fully. It should be able to support that load. More than that, you need to add more. Does that answer your question?
Yep. So 1% for the error rates.
Yeah, or under. I mean, you want under that. 75 to 85. I mean, Ravi can qualify that.
Let me come back to that. Let me finish instead of starvation. Yeah.
Will this work on Linux? I know you said it would. Will it get the CPU and memory stuff on it?
Yes, we added support for
So
that.
the question was, will it work on Linux? And I think I omitted an important point. It can collect, it can run against a Tableau server install that's done on Linux. It cannot currently be installed to a Linux box. So the actual TabJolt installation has to be on Windows machine. We're going to fix that in the next release, but it's not quite there yet. It should be fairly quickly available. Yes, it can in the latest release.
Yes.
In the latest releases, does the latest release of TabJolt have to match like a release of?
No, it's backward compatible. So it's just if you're using an older version, if you're using the preceding release of TabJolt, it won't work with, I think, or you have to do kind of some funky workarounds to get it to work with 2018 1 or 2. But if you, yeah, so if you download the latest version, this should work great.
Yeah.
You should be good to go.
Just one caveat to that. If you have, it's not backwards compatible, if you have 10.5 desktop and you run this,
Oh.
try and open it up, 10.5 desktop will not be able to.
Oh, fair point, yes. That is an excellent point.
1 second. I'll come to it, sorry.
Yeah.
So you emphasize not too much stock into the response times. The dashboard can be a slow one to start with. Is there any way you could measure each dashboard in isolation? Its response time upload
Yeah. So if you are interested in just measuring one dashboard, You can go to that CSV file. You can take out everything else, just leave one dashboard, figure out the number of threads you want to load against your server, just go off of it, and that gives you some baseline of what this dashboard will look when the system is under load. You can repeat that for other dashboards. It gives you some idea, and then you can mix them together and see how the system behaves.
And that's kind of more, so I'll repeat the question just for the sake of the recording. Can you do the testing for TabJolt against a single workbook to figure out what the response time should be? Is that correct? Oh, report. Oh, I see. Okay. Yeah, the deviation. So the admin views, I believe, have a view on that. It's going to be, I don't know how easy it'll be to get the exact representation you're looking for, but I think it does have variance in there in terms of like, here's the average time and here's kind of the range that we see in the response times in the admin views.
One second, this side
Oh,
will have
I'll let him
we'll come back
step
to
back.
This side again.
Let's not make it confusing.
It depends, right? So if it is off the hours, if you think that there's not going to be much usage, you should be okay. You can get away with it. During business hours, definitely not, right? Because you'll be loading your system while users are on there. Evaluate. It depends on what you're trying to do and what your organization's rules are, etc.
Currently, we have a test production that is not comparable.
Okay.
So it wouldn't give us a reasonable facsimile of the results from the production.
How different they are. So that might tell you some things, right? Okay.
Okay, that'll
Yeah,
make
see
a big
that,
difference.
right? Yeah.
Thank you, for sharing this with me. It's very valuable. Question is, I'm struggling trying to justify an upgrade to the cost, for example, memory. Memory where Hyper.
Uh-oh, you're going to be kicked out.
Oh.
I don't think so. No.
Hyper is always, I think, utilizing a lot as much memory as it has.
Yes.
How do you set up optimize that you have enough that could be cached while not having too much memory that you don't really need?
Yeah. In next release, I believe they're releasing a version where you can. Right now, it doesn't let you decide where to put Hyper on in the topology. It will put Hyper on every box wherever there is a file store, wherever there is a SQL server. In 2018 maybe 2019.1, there is a way where you can just extract Hyper out of the topology and put it on its own box so that it doesn't interfere with SQL Server or other services. I know it doesn't exactly answer, but at least it
I think they're going to kick us out. We can actually, I'm happy to stand
I'm
outside.
Stay.
Yeah, I'm happy to stand outside
Yep.
here and answer other questions.
We'll
and
stay
I'm
there,
sure
so-
Robbie as well. We just don't want to impede the next talk here.